Hello, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to a rather special Thinkln, hosted sort of by us but very much with the all-party parliamentary group for Oracy and speaking skills. My name is Liz Mosley, I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise, and I'm thrilled to be here today to convene a conversation, the recording of which will form part of the inquiry's report that will be submitted, I believe, in the autumn of this year. So to be aware, if you would like to participate, and we very much hope that you do, either in the chat or to come on screen, put up your little digital blue hand if you can find it in the participants button if you'd like to participate in the conversation, to respond to some of the points we're making. And then be aware we're recording it, and all of this is sort of on the record official stuff that will be submitted with the inquiry. We have got four amazing speakers who come at this question: are speaking skills under threat just when we need them the most, with slightly different perspectives that I'll bring in at the beginning of the conversation. But as I say, a Thinkln isn't a Thinkln if it's just the invited speakers, and we very much do want to hear from all of you in the room with where you're at. Tell us a little bit about your perspective, your career, your experience in the space, things that you think will be useful to bring to bear to this debate. The point of Tortoise is to listen, not to speak, so I'm going to try not to bore on for too much longer. My colleague Tom has just posted his first message in the chat. There he is. Hello, Tom. And he will be sort of convening the messages and ideas and things that get posted in there. So if you do want to join in, either hold forth with Tom or put your little blue hand up if you'd like me to come to you later. I'm going to start the bidding this afternoon, please, if I can, with Emma Hardy MP, who joins us. She's the chair of APPG and a former primary school teacher, and Shadow Minister for Further Education in the universities. And Emma, I guess to start us off, I think the audience in the room, the virtual room, is somewhat self-selecting. We're all here because we care about this particular change, I guess, in the way we think about speaking skills and what children in particular need. But why does this in particular matter to you? You've really gone big on this for your sort of political influencing career. Just unpick some of the things about this that make it so important, particularly now.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for organising this for me, and apologies in advance for the various alarms and beeps that go off. I'm speaking from my Westminster office, so there's always bells and things happening. I think this comes from, I suppose, my own background, in that I was, as you mentioned, a primary school teacher, well, an infant school teacher, actually, for 11 years. And before that, I worked in children's nurseries. So I've worked with children from 6 weeks old all the way up to 6 years old. And then I have 2 children myself. So I suppose language development, especially with, very small children, has always been so crucially important to me. And when you're working in infants, one of the things you're sort of focusing on is that first starting to write, first starting to think in sentences, and you really see the crucial importance of having good speaking and listening skills. And when you're working with very small children, you see it important not for academic reasons, but also for their own development as little people, and for their ability to express themselves, and for their ability to communicate with others, to form friendships, to have that special development. And you can also see when this isn't, where there is some delays in this with some children, how that can cause such frustration as they can't make themselves heard and they don't feel like they're being listened to, because everybody, whether you're 18 months old or 80 years old, wants to feel listened to and respected. And so it's come from, I suppose, my own teaching experience, my own experience working with very small children, about why it is so crucially important. And I think it's important to say this isn't just about debating. This is not about creating thousands of children who can join the Oxford Debating Society, although debating societies are very important too. But this is about helping people have that civilized disagreement. How do you disagree without being disagreeable? And that's what I used to try and teach when I was working with children, even from that very small age. Like, how do we disagree with each other nicely? What kind of words can we use if we're disagreeing with each other nicely? How can we explain how we're feeling about something? And that teaching of tolerance and mutual respect, which is not just important in politics, but really important in everyday life. Now, we've seen what's going on in our country at the moment. We're seeing sort of, powerful changes happening within politics, and people who feel marginalized, disrespected, and not listened to. And I think we can all, nobody can change everything, but everyone can change something, as we always say. And teaching that tolerance, teaching that mutual respect, learning to listen to each other, learning to express how we feel, I think not only helps us as individuals, but helps us as a society. And you can model that within a classroom, as well as trying to model it, I think, in the greater world. And that's not to say that we expect everybody to agree with everything we say, even if we say it, in a convincing manner. But it's about just, having that communication. I think that's really important for children's mental health as well, that they get that ability to express themselves. It's no coincidence that much of the mental health support is around communication and the spoken word. Tell me how you feel. Sit down and tell me about it. This is, so I think it's important. Sorry, I'm going on way too much. I'm not giving brilliant examples of Oracy here, but it's about, really, to me, it's about developing as individuals, developing children, and giving them their voice and giving them their own power and their own skills to be able to communicate how they feel about the world.
Thanks, Emma. Yes, it's interesting because not having a voice that is used quite commonly in a sort of culture wars, as a metaphor in the culture wars, the feeling of not having a voice. In Oracy, what you've just described is there's literally having a voice, and that sort of metaphorical meaning of having a voice, that those two things are closely related in terms of my sense of myself, where I fit in the world, how I relate to other people collectively and individually. It's interesting as well what you say about we're not just talking about training people how to debate in the commercial world, and I'll come to Paul Dressler in a second. In the commercial world, communication skills, or they're quite often confused with presentation skills. So you can go on a course to learn how to deliver a PowerPoint. And my frustration sometimes with my teams, particularly young women actually, is that when I talk to them about presentation skills, I mean literally just, when you go to a meeting, or when you bump into your boss at the coffee machine, or these days on a Zoom call. That's all. It's all the same thing. It's about how to orient yourself and to influence people. If I come to Paul now, Paul Dressler, who is chair of Teach First, obviously, and was president of the CBI. I feel, Paul, although you correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a direct line, or you may see a direct line between Oracy, as we're talking about it here, and employability, and therefore, in some way, social mobility. Am I projecting, or is that why you think this matters?
Well, firstly, can I just say I'm absolutely thrilled and I'm honoured to be amongst so many people who are of such high standing in the world of education. And high standing, to my mind, starts in the classroom with brilliant teachers. I've had the privilege of 6 years as chair of Teach First, which I handed over to Vivian Hunt last November. And before that, through Business in the Community, where I worked on getting businesses to work with schools. So the first thing I'd say is the most important thing to do in all of this debate is to make sure that every child has the gift of a great teacher. And we know today there are schools in disadvantaged areas with all sorts of vacancies and challenges recruiting people, and we know there's just teachers doing a fantastic job. So I'm not going to profess to know anything about the world of education, but I can tell you from the world of business that the overriding priority across all businesses, be the members of the CBI, the British Chamber of Commerce, London First, and so on, is that young people have actually got communication skills. It is a fundamental requirement, not just of success, of even starting into the world of work. And I'm going to give a couple of examples which to me are startling and bring home the significance of this particular discussion today. in a post-COVID world. Over the past few weeks, Walmart in the USA recruited over 250,000 people. Tesco recruited over 50,000 people. You cannot be recruited into the world of work today if you cannot speak clearly, speak effectively, engage your audience, and adapt to the challenges. To my mind, in the world of the future, the communication thing is more important than ever. And I didn't know what Oracy is when I was first asked about this, but what I can tell you is there will be great opportunities once we get through this mess at the moment. There will be fantastic opportunities, but today they're available to the most advantaged children in society, and they're not available to the least advantaged by a factor of 2 to 3. It's about your postcode, it's about your family wealth. And when you analyze a lot of that, then you find that there's definitely more than 1 million children with some sort of persistent communication need, if I can put it that way. To my mind, the only way to address that is in the classroom with brilliant teachers. And we're lucky to have so many, but we do need to do an awful lot more. So it's the passport to work, I would say. It's a fundamental requirement. It's as important as the oxygen that we breathe when it comes to opportunity in the future.
Do you think, Paul, that, and I have sat on in other think-ins with a different group of people, business people, but who work principally in the technology world, who have talked to me about how actually digital communication, virtual communication, and this is, I'm going back to before COVID happened and we all spent our lives on Zoom calls and Google Hangouts and everything else, who would argue that that literacy, not oracy, literacy was declining as a requirement to teach in the classroom because you've got autocorrect and you've got this and that. And actually, it's much more important that we equip children with, for example, skills to determine information to believe and not to believe. You can see the sort of tension. It's all about choices, isn't it? And I'm just wondering, in terms of equipping children in school for the world of work, how do you see this stuff falling out?
Well, look, I confess I might be a Neanderthal man. I was born in the 19th, but I just do not believe that there is a joyous, happy life for people in the world today if they can't engage with their friends, play with their friends, talk with their friends, discuss with their friends. And in the world of work, even if you have digital skills up the wazoo, if you don't have the ability to articulate the words and thoughts, first of all, you can't convert them to digital skills. To my mind, it's like saying you can read all the books in the world, but you don't have to speak the language or know the alphabet. I don't think it's a choice of one or the other. I think these are all building blocks, but they start with character. They start, to my mind, with the work, again, that was done by Tom Ravenscroft on the essential skills that young people need to succeed in life, of which communication in the broadest sense was one of the 8 essential skills that for life. Digital happens to be one of them.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Actually, one of the big themes that I took away from the education summit we had on Tortoise last week was this thing about learning to think rather than learning to remember, in the context of work. And of course, the relationship between thinking and speaking is a very interesting and important one. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to just quickly, if I can, and if she's okay, Nicola Jones-Ford in the chat has made a really interesting, well, she's asked a question. Nicola, I don't know if you're comfortable to come on. Hiya.
Yeah. Hello.
Talking to us a little bit about you. So you're a Senko in a primary school.
Yeah, I'm a Senko in a primary school. I have been a secondary Senko as well. And we seem to be getting more and more children through our nursery that literally have no words, or they have, you know, they can do their colours, their numbers, they can do the alphabet, but they can't have a conversation with you, and they can't even tell you, you know, they need to go to the toilet or they've had an accident or anything like that. And I was just wondering if other people are finding that the Oracy skills of children when they walk through the door in school are just seem to be diminishing.
And that's something that's happened recently, Nicola. You've noticed a change over time.
Yeah, I was a reception class teacher back in, oh blimey, 1992, and the children in my class then could tell me exactly what they needed, all those sorts of things, and have a conversation with me. But now it seems that things have, you know, they just don't know how to do it, and it's very strange.
Interesting. I can see, thanks ever so much, Nicola, and I can see Kate Freeman in the chat agreeing with you. It'd be interesting. It's probably another thinking entirely, actually, but it'd be interesting to sort of have a go round on that. I'm going to go back a little bit to something we talked about with Emma at the beginning. If I can come to Stephen Coleman, he's Professor of Political Communication at Leeds University, my beloved Leeds, I'm from Leeds. And your interest in speaking, it's a bit like the thing I was saying about literally having a voice and feeling as though you have a voice, having a stake in the world. And you talk about the need for speaking skills in the context of citizenship and having agency politically. Just unpack that a little bit for us, Stephen, if you can.
Yes, thank you. Look, the work of being a citizen is hard. I think that's something we don't say often enough. It's not easy. I mean, it's relatively easy to be a consumer. You know, you go in a Tesco, you look at the prices, you decide which sort of baked beans you want. When you're a citizen, you kind of don't quite know how it came about. You get this thing called a passport. You are subject to this stuff called the law. You are made to support a national football team, which somehow is badly performing on your behalf, and you're trying to work out where you stand and who you are. And I think we have to start from that basis, that citizenship is all about voice and it is all about agency. And by agency, I mean the capacity to act with confidence in the most minimal or the most life important ways to bring about effects that you want to see. And this involves three things that are deeply related to what we're talking about today. And I refer to those as expressing, listening, and working through. Expressing what one thinks and feels to be meaningful is not easy. You can find the words, but whether there is a congruity between what you want to say and how you say it and how people hear you and what they expect of you is not easy. So expression is hard. Listening is harder. Listening to others with a view to establishing shared meaning, the act of, you know, what the philosopher Martin Buber calls leaning forward, just sort of moving towards the other person. And the third of these, I think, is the most difficult, and that's working through the ramifications of contested meanings, so that it can range from looking out of the window and me saying it's a nice day today and you saying the world is in a terrible state, to the government is doing a fantastic job managing this pandemic, to what a cock up. And how you deal with that kind of contestation is really important. And one of the reasons it's important for us to teach it is because the cultural template that is available for citizenship is pretty damn awful. The aggressive tone of political discourse is not encouraging. The cacophony of online discussion, the rather sullen, simmering rage of vast numbers of people who feel excluded, they're not inviting tones for people to come into this civic discussion.
Yeah.
And yet, and this is a point I want to make, and it relates to the big research project that I'm now involved in with other scholars called Speaking Citizens. young people find tremendously creative ways of improvising their way through this mess, of unlearning the cultural template. I don't think it's always about learning. I think unlearning is quite important. You've got to sometimes switch on the news and say, that is how not to speak. You've got to sometimes, dare I say it, listen to your teacher or head teacher and say, part of that is what I want to be when I grow up, but part of that is not what I want to be. And making those decisions and arriving at those conclusions is a hugely important part of democracy. And I think part of what we want to do in our research is to investigate those contexts in which people are having to improvise creatively as everyday communicators. And just to conclude, we're doing it in 4 groups of people who are studying ethnographically over a year. Kids who are caught up in the justice system, either in courts or in prisons and approved schools. Young trade unionists who are involved in recruitment campaigns to get other young people into the trade unions. Young nurses working within the NHS, and young performers who think they have something to say and want to work out interesting ways of performing it. And all of those, I think, can create, let us call it a counter template to some of the things that have gone wrong with public communication.
It's completely fascinating. I'm experiencing a high degree of professional envy for your utterly amazing project, Stephen. Thank you so much, and I couldn't agree more. So much of what we're trying to do at Tortoise, in fact, funny enough, we call Thinkins a forum for civilized disagreement, and when we have these Thinkins with just amazing, you know, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids who come and put us all to shame with their ability to just land a point brutally in sort of, you know, 15 words, it's fantastic. So thank you so much. I'm going to pick up a couple of points from the chat and from the floor. Sally Harper, your little blue digital hand has been up for a while. Is that intentional, or have you hit the button by accident? Have you got something that you want to say, Sally? Hi.
Can I unmute myself?
Yes, you're there. I can hear you.
Okay, first time I've ever done anything like this. Yeah, I went into teaching really late. So I was a teaching assistant, and I did a foundation degree in education support, and I got really, really interested in dialogic teaching and just kind of so many things that I didn't even know that existed to do with literacy. And then I became a teacher in mainstream schools, and I was just so incredibly disappointed at our whole attitude towards literacy, really. I mean, it was fine in sort of like, you know, up to 2010 when we valued speaking and listening, and we had the Rose Report and the Crick Report and the Cambridge Primary Review and all these wonderful bits of research that were out. And then they just disappeared from 2010 onwards. And so I obviously went into teaching at the wrong time, I think, because since then it seems that it's not valued. And of course, why would teachers value teaching it? And parents, actually, you talked about, you know, very small children coming in and not being able to speak very well. Well, why would their parents value that when actually the message they're getting from schools all the time is that it's the reading and the writing, and that's the stuff you've got to concentrate at home on with these small children? Well, of course, you know, before we value speaking and listening, then maybe parents were focusing on that, and teachers certainly were. What's happening now?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And actually, Sam, was it Sam Kavanagh, has made a comment in the chat, which I think relates to what you're saying, Sally, which is even if a school or a teacher is all ears and into this as important and a thing that they want to develop and nurture in their students, I can envisage a sort of, oh, okay, well, let me just add it to the list, shall I? You know, because I've got to be measured on all these other things. Yeah. So I can understand why it's hard to see how it could be. I mean, I know it's not a question of inserting and adding, but reframing everything so that there is an equal bias on reading, writing, speaking and listening. It's such a big sea change, you know, reading and writing, you know, the 3 R's, they've been there forever, you know, it's such a big sort of philosophical shift, or it feels that way. But maybe Peter Hyman can convince us it's not that big of a shift, because you've founded a school with this as its sort of principle in its heart, Peter. Tell us it's possible.
It is possible. We started that right from the beginning. So we were determined to make it a dialogic school because we thought it was everything hanging together by dialogue. And it also symbolized, as lots of other people are saying on this, in this conversation, that it's a symbolizing a different relationship between teacher and student, which is rather than just imparting knowledge and students to sit there, which even the Secretary of State in the last week has said we want them back passively in rows looking at the front. This is a sense that you make better meaning and you make better learning and better thinking by dialogue. And of course, the ancient Greeks believed this as well. When they talked about the trivium, they talked about grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Grammar was knowledge, and the other two were versions of oracy or performance. And dialectic, I think, is the central one. So others have touched on the dialogic classroom. And that's the idea that through wrestling with the knowledge, you are getting better thinking and better meaning. So right from the start, both as a school culture and in individual lessons, we had oracy at its heart. So, for example, just to give you 2 or 3 ways in which this is possible, assemblies were done in the round using oracy and drama skills. So from the moment a student came into the school, they knew that they were expected to talk, and they did so in different settings. And then we worked out, well, how to break them down into small groups with different protocols or pairs with different protocol. And you start to then, young people from the age, we do this from the age of 4, are getting used to popping up in front of, up to 75, 100 people, using their voice and in smaller groups, just second nature. And our mission, again, others have touched on this, was to put oracy and speaking, give it the same status as reading and writing, because it's absolutely crucial. And if not, as Paul was saying, if not more so in the world that we're going to go into. So it's got to be a change in the coming years. There was a great phrase I heard from Andreas Schleicher of the OECD, actually at the Tortoise event, the summit last week, where he said we're training up young people to become second-rate robots. Whereas actually what we need to do is train them for all those human interactions, which are going to be where humans are always going to have an advantage over AI and over robotics in the future. So that's got to be at the heart of what a school believes. So, I mean, just to finish on this point, I mean, and it goes back to what others have said already, this is 2 things, Orosi. It is both the metaphor of finding your voice, and to find an identity. And sometimes for all of us, that's a sort of lifelong quest to really work out who we are and what we want to say. But that's got to start in school, and it links to what Stephen said about citizenship. But also it's a set of very teachable skills. And I think what until quite recently we've thought is somehow, we start, anyone with young children know, you start with sort of grunts and then babble and then little words pop out and we're all excited we can remember our child's first word. And then once they can speak, we somehow think the job is done. So from about 2 or 3 onwards, we're not intentional in the way that we are about reading and writing and thinking we can actually improve as speakers. If we're really thinking about it in the classroom and at home, we can get more and more sophisticated about how we use our speech to great effect and to project who we are and what we want to say.
Thanks, Peter. I can see hands going up, Sam Cook and Peter Worley. I'm going to come to you in a second. Before I leave Peter, sorry, Peter, I can see you taking a breath. You're not going to have a rest just yet. Before I leave Peter, you set up your school with this in the middle from the beginning.
Yeah.
But if you are a school that doesn't have Oracy anywhere near it at the moment, a well-established school that runs in a inverted commas traditional way, what are some of the things, just a couple briefly, that you might do to start to make that change? Because you can't just kind of tear it all up and start again. How do you begin to implement some of this stuff?
Well, Voice 21, of course, who are involved in the APPG and helped get it established and have worked in this space to convene a lot of this. They're working with 700 schools with very sophisticated programs now about interacting at different levels with those schools or with clusters of schools to train up individual teachers, but to work with the school. It's now produced very recently a set of benchmarks where a school at the level of the school, but also of the level of the classroom, can think under different areas, what does it actually take? And so different schools will decide, and what's great about those benchmarks and the way the Voice 21 training is, schools can be, and there's an audit tool that goes with it, schools can start with where they're at and go on their own personal journey of saying, well, actually, well, let's start with a cluster of teachers who are really up for this. Yeah. And let's see how they can change their classroom. Then we can build out and they can work with other teachers. We can also work with certain school practices. So the assemblies and changing them is one way. What we do, although as others have said, it's not just about public speaking, most of it is about small group dialogue. We have what we call Ignite speeches, which are a bit like TED Talks, where every child learns over the space of many weeks to then perform with no notes a short speech, which is about a passion of theirs or something they really want to talk about. And that journey of learning how to be a public speaker involves lots of other Oracy and well-being skills along the way. So there's a whole range of ways that Voice 21 have been really skilled at taking schools on this journey.
Yeah. Fabulous, thank you very much. I think Carolyn Gelenter, if that's how I pronounce your surname, has made an important point in the chat about children and young people in particular who come from diverse backgrounds or poorer kids perhaps, because they don't know the sort of unwritten rules of influencing adults and presenting themselves and those kinds of things. And so that's the sort of direct link to mobility, listening and speaking, I guess, in just how to sort of operate, I guess, in a grown-up world. And I like Sana Sara, I might, if we have time, I'd love to know more about a storytelling school and what that means as a philosophy. But let's try and get some of the blue hands down. So let's come to Sam Cook, if we can. You've had your little blue hand up for a while, Sam. Hello. Hi.
So I'm a trainee English teacher with Teach First. So I'm currently doing my teacher training as we speak, and I'm actually here now because my tutor highlighted this session because we had a session about the importance of Oracy this morning. So I just wanted to add that I don't think the landscape is possibly as bleak as we're maybe thinking it is. You know, I understand that my experience as a trainee isn't going to be universal, but this is something that lots of you know, my colleagues who are training find really interesting. And before I started my training, I worked as a cover supervisor, and in that school they were starting to turn on to the benefits of Oracy. And I think as school leaders become more in tune to evidence-based practice, the sort of general consensus on Oracy is really shifting, because, you know, the evidence to support it absolutely is there. And hopefully the new sort of intake of teachers who are being explicitly told about Oracy now will be able to help shift the tide.
Do you think so? Are you training to teach big people or little people?
Big people. I'm going to be an English and media teacher in September.
Okay. Do you think that the Oracy focus in your training for English particularly, because it's not just about an English sort of content, is it? It's a sort of holistic thing. Do you have sense from colleagues that are being trained in other subjects whether they're getting the same feeling, or is it mainly on your subject, would you say? Maybe? Well,
from my experience working as a cover supervisor, so that's in a school that's different to the one I'm going to be working at in September, they had sort of literacy coordinators, which I think is quite common in most schools, but they also covered Oracy and encouraged Oracy in other subjects. So I have sort of distant memories of in science they were doing it really, really well to discuss things like climate change. And in history as well. I think in their unit on the transatlantic slave trade, they had pupils, you know, discussing sort of what was going on there. I covered a couple of lessons in that area. So I think it's getting there. Obviously the focus for me is because I'm going to be an English teacher, but I do think that we're getting there in other subjects. I really do.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sam, and good luck with the rest of your training.
Thanks.
Let's go to Peter now. Peter Worley, please. You've had your little blue hand up. Are you there, Peter? Oh, he disappeared. There you are. Hi, Peter. We can hear you now.
Okay, good. A little bit of a glitch there, but so I'm Peter Worley from the Philosophy Foundation, which is a charity that does philosophy in schools, mainly primary schools, but also primary and secondary and above. And what we do is we have a very simple method of doing philosophy based on the Socratic tradition, where we simply ask the children to do what I call the dialectical triangle. I ask them to do just 3 things: to think, speak, and listen. That's all they need to be able to do to engage in philosophical dialogue in that kind of Greek tradition. So totally eschews all the barriers of reading and writing, etc., etc. Mm. So just a little heads up on what I do. But one of the things that's really bothering us at the Philosophy Foundation, and I think many others, is that the technology is there to be able to continue, perhaps even stronger than ever, dialogic relationships between classes and pupils, using Zoom and other similar platforms. The technology is there to really ensure that those dialogues not only happen, but possibly even happen better than they did before because of the way in which it's reliant on this. But the schools that we work in, the state schools that we work in, I think not one of them will use these platforms to enable us to deliver what they've paid for us to do. So we've sat for X amount of weeks now, just with nothing. Now, as it happens, my daughter is at one of the schools that I work at. She's in year 4. And from the parent point of view, the lack of dialogic communication is absolutely appalling. You know, she's spoken to her teacher once in 12 weeks on the telephone. They have a bunch of, links and lesson plans. Nothing dialogic, of course. No teaching in it here. We all know this, right? No teaching. It's just worksheets. They can only do it if they really know what to do already.
Yeah.
So absolutely sort of dead communication when it could be really, really good. Private schools, on the other hand, are all over this technology.
Yeah.
We're working in, we do 28 online lessons a week, most of which are in private schools or amongst parents that have got together and just are sorting it out for themselves. And just as an anecdote, we finished our course of philosophy sessions for my daughter's class that we ran for the parents independently. And they all just said, this is fantastic. This is the only time our class have seen each other in 12 weeks.
Yeah.
What is going on here?
Yeah.
The technology for dialogue is there. It's just not being used.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Peter. I'm going to come to Alice because she's had her hand up for a while, and then I'm going to, if I can, come to Sarah Sheffield, who's a speech and language therapist and has been active in the chat, because I think we need to get into this question of children who, for whatever reason, need extra additional help with this, to cover that off. But let's come to Alice first, if we can. Hi, Alice.
Hi. So I'm a member of the Voice 21 team, and I just wanted to pick up on some of the points around kind of, obviously, School 21 started from a blank canvas, but what's the picture across other schools nationally? Because I think it's really interesting, the point around, is it a big shift or not? And in our experience, there's so many different kind of pulls on schools that mean that they view this as a priority, and lots of the reasons that the panel have mentioned, whether that is a kind of citizenship angle, whether it's about inequality between students kind of on arrival and the fear that that gap will grow. But I think for lots of schools, there really is a push on this. And I think, like, I was talking to a school this morning that was a school in special measures who had taken on Orosi through working with us, with 65% of their students people premium, and lots of other people have basically said to them, you're mad, why are you going to do this? And they have now gone to good, and they credit that with being much to do with Orosi. So I think that idea about, like, it not just kind of being something that hopefully might happen in an English lesson or in an extracurricular club is so important. And I think for schools that understand that and recognise that it's a whole school approach, they really do feel the benefit. And that's not confined to your kind of leafy lanes schools in nice, in wealthier areas, but also schools that serve more deprived populations. And I think around the kind of accessibility question, what we've found is lots of schools go, oh yeah, we were kind of doing talk related things, but we hadn't thought about the fact that we also needed to teach our students explicitly how to engage with them. And if we don't do that, we perpetuate inequality in terms of access to talk and oracy within the classroom. So I think, yeah, just kind of on the point about kind of why do schools think about it and how do they approach it? I think for lots of schools, that's a kind of really key kind of penny drop moment almost of thinking about, well, who is it in the classroom that's doing the talking? What's the kind of role of it in supporting learning, and how does it support the core curriculum? You know, it's not an extra. Somebody raised the point earlier about, you know, squeezed content heavy curriculums. How does it fit? It's not an extra to that. It's how you teach that, which is so important.
Thanks so much, Alice. Let's go now, if we can, if you're there, Sarah Sheffield. Are you there, Sarah?
I'm here. Hello.
Hi, Sarah. You're a speech and language therapist.
I am, yes. So I'm a speech and language therapist that I work mostly in secondary schools, actually.
Right.
And I'm an academic now, so I work at Sheffield University.
Okay.
I used to work for ICANN, so I used to work going around different secondary schools and working with schools to really get the curriculum to focus on communication right across the whole school. So it's really heartening to see this turn towards Oracy in the curriculum. I think it's great, but I guess as a speech therapist, sometimes I have a little niggle that a lot of children find spoken language really difficult. And that's not obvious for a lot of the time, so children can have quite an invisible difficulty with spoken language. So I'm just genuinely interested in how the speakers in this chat have approached differentiation, so how they can support different children to access Oracy and to be involved in dialogic learning from different starting points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if that's something that perhaps Peter might be able to, Peter Hyman might be able to come back on, because it's a live thing that you're dealing with, or anybody else who's using these techniques in the classroom, who can talk to the sort of, how do you handle the lack of a level playing field, like from where the kids start from, how do you sort of account for different abilities and needs and what have you. Alice, you've got your hand up.
I can come in as well.
Oh, let's if we can unmute Alice, perhaps. There you go.
There we
You
go.
were quick on the draw with
yeah, I mean, it's just because it's a really live area for us as Voice 21. Obviously, we work with hundreds of schools, and it's an area that we're always kind of learning more about. I think our kind of starting point position is that we think that a talk-rich classroom can benefit everybody, whether they're, you know, English as an additional language, whether they're high attaining, whether they've got SEND needs, whether they have speech and language communication needs specifically. I think there's a number of ways that it can benefit. So I think firstly, just more talk in the classroom enables teachers to identify students with speech, language and communication needs who otherwise may be kind of masked and just go completely unnoticed in classrooms where, you know, a child can kind of drift through the day and hopefully avoid having to participate in any kind of formal conversation or contributions to talk in the classroom. So it helps with firstly just identifying need in the first place and making sure those students access specialist support where appropriate. But then we've also found that the culture of the classroom is so important, and particularly actually building a culture where listening is valued as much as talking. For lots of children, it's a fear that they'll say something and they won't be listened to. So we often start with teachers thinking about a culture of listening, both for the teacher to genuinely be listening and a kind of, you know, have high expectations in terms of what they expect their students to say, that they are going to say something valuable and worthwhile, and that, you know, that might take time and support. But also for students to listen to each other and be supportive. But then I guess the next kind of layer of our approach is about explicit teaching of those skills. So again, often for students with speech, language and communication needs, it's just assumed that they'll just kind of pick those skills up, that they'll know how to you know, join a discussion, they'll know how to respond when somebody said something challenging. And so all of our approaches are about kind of making those explicit and not singling out any group of students in particular for that, because we think everybody benefits when those implicit rules of classroom talk are made explicit and are shared, and obviously have really high expectations around them to support everybody to access them.
Yeah, thank you, very much, Alice. I'm going to come to Carolyn. I've also some back and forth in the chat with Sam, who we spoke to earlier, has caught my eye, because in another world, I'm partway through a master's in sociocultural linguistics, so I'm very obsessed with accentism, and I'm interested. One, we'll come to that in a second. Let's go to Carolyn, and then we'll come on to what Sam's talking about, because it's fascinating. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi. Perhaps it's very relevant that I have an Australian accent then.
Yeah, excellent. It's almost like we planned it.
So a couple of things I want to say is that I think there's lots of white elephants in the room when it comes to talking about listening and speaking. First of all, we're one of the only countries in the world that start children at 4 years of age on an academic curriculum. So again, if you come from a disadvantaged background, or perhaps a non-English speaking background, you're going to be at a disadvantage, because we know you develop language through play. So if you don't have that opportunity, so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing that I also find absolutely astonishing is we are living in a country where teachers are trained rather than educated. So in Australia, you cannot teach in primary or early years if you are not 4 years educated at university with a degree in early childhood education or primary education. Now, I'm not saying therefore that every teacher that graduates is brilliant, or that teachers that do short courses here are not. Some of them are amazing, but in principle, what we're saying is that our teachers require less education and training than car mechanics. And then the third thing I just want to say is that there's this amazing project going on in Australia and New Zealand called Building Skills for the Future. So one of the things that often gets left out of, I think, primary and secondary thinking about communication skills is the physical environment and how we set that up for learning. So if you look at early years, there's now some very interesting research on how the physical environment impacts on, specifically on communication skills, particularly around outdoor nature stuff, but also some indoor, the way we set up indoors. So Melbourne University, along with government and business, have actually, they're leading this program called Pursuit, Schools for the 21st Century. You can look it up online. And they're knocking down school buildings and rebuilding them along 3 key principles, all of which have communication at the heart. So collaboration, flexibility, and creativity, all of which, you know, require good communication skills. So I really recommend people look into that. It's a fantastic program called Pursuit, Schools for the 21st Century. Thanks, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always good to hear how it works in other countries, right? We can be a little bit narrow sometimes in our thinking. So I just want to pick up a couple of points about this thing about linguistics. One of my worries, actually, and I didn't know what Orosi was before we kind of started these conversations at Tortoise either. One of my worries was that the content, or maybe the implication of a greater focus on teaching speaking as a skill might end up becoming, you know, by accident almost, a sense of a prescriptive way of saying what is and isn't the right way to speak. And that can be, you know, damaging and difficult for those people who, you know, who don't speak the Queen's English, and let's face it, who does, you know. And I was pleased to, when I sort of challenged Peter on that a little bit last week, to sort of hear that it's really not about saying you must, you know, articulate in this way and that this grammar is correct and this grammar is not. It's about constructing arguments and so on. I'd quite like to go to
Liz,
yes.
just to come in on that. But I think what is really important is register. And, you know, we do a lot of teaching of the setting that you register in context. So you still need to know the difference between I'm now in a formal setting.
Yeah.
So the sort of language you're shouting at your friend in the playground with is not appropriate. And so again, being really agile, because all of us, we talk differently if we're speaking to our child or our mother or a friend or someone formal at work, or we're making a complaint. If you think about all the different Orosi interactions in a given day, part of the skill of this is training students, particularly when they're young and growing, to work out, in a sense, what hat I'm now wearing, and therefore what should I speak like. So it's that repertoire that I think is crucial.
Yeah, and I guess to have an understanding of that repertoire, which unless perhaps it was brought to your attention, you wouldn't necessarily know it was there. That's a hugely applicable skill to then also navigating other forms of information, written information and what have you. Know, where am I? If this is in Twitter, it means this. If this is over, I think there's lots of, you know, critical and other forms of thinking that could be useful for too. I was just going to actually pick up on Susie Kershaw, who's commented a couple of times as well in the chat, talking about multilingualism, people who can speak more than one language, and how that plays into this. Susie, are you there?
Yes.
Hi. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective. Are you a teacher, or what's your...
I'm a professional translator and interpreter, and also I get involved with training people in making presentations. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is the fact that if you learn a second language, you learn about the fact that these sorts of things exist in another language and that they could be said differently. So you are getting a message in the process of learning another language. So I'm very concerned that there is less learning of another language going on. And therefore, how you treat people who come into your school or into your class who don't speak your own language, it's obvious when it's a foreign language, but all these other issues are there in our own language as well. And I feel as monolinguals, and I've been banging on about this for quite a few years, as monolinguals, we actually have a very big Achilles heel in that most other cultures and most other places, and many of the people now British citizens, many of them have a second language and they know some of these things inherently.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about how some of these exciting projects are going to enable people in classrooms to learn that if someone comes at you and raises a fist, it might not mean what you think it might mean, but verbally they might come at you with something that feels aggressive. It just might be that you're listening to someone whose parents are Dutch and who, when they speak English, sound quite straightforward about how they're speaking. And so we're picking up things in different ways, which if you learn another language, gives another advantage. And when you go for jobs, when you go into the workplace, you're going to encounter this. You may lose jobs to all those people who have been brought up speaking English as well.
Fascinating. Thanks ever so much, Susie. As we get into our last sort of 5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to come back just in a second to Paul, who I know wants to weigh in on another point. I've got a couple of sort of polling questions that I want to ask. So if you can all sort of get ready to practice with finding your little blue hand, we're going to do a virtual show of hands on a couple of questions. And I would also like to come back specifically, perhaps with Emma, or anybody who would like to talk particularly about the attainment gap, or the gap in educational experience that's happened after COVID, and how speech and communication and what have you might help with well-being as people kind of come back into the classroom and perhaps find themselves at a different level. But let's go to Paul. Paul Dreschler, I know you want to come back on a couple of things. Hi, Paul.
Look, I think if you're from the world of business and you heard this conversation was going on, you might ask, why after 2,000 years are we still discussing what would appear to most people to be a most logical consideration? And that's the importance of Orosi. I mean, to my mind, when I look at this, I come to the point that Emma made at the beginning. That is, if you look at children from disadvantaged backgrounds, half as many of them are achieving language learning goals by the time they are 5 years old. And we know that your ability to speak, communicate at 5 years old is a very key predictor of how you're going to achieve at the age of 14. So if the purpose of the all-parliamentary group is to make a significant impact in this area, it would strike me as we need to really get some momentum into early years teaching education around Oracy skills, and then build up from there, because otherwise they're starting primary school already 5 years behind their wealthier peers. They just, to me, you fuel inequality if you don't address this really important issue right through the school system. Thank you.
From the get-go, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. There are loads of hands up. I wonder if I might. I'd quite like to go. We're going to run out of time. I can see there's too much to go up. But I also wanted to ask questions about how Orosi can be assessed, measured, or scored. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of measurement, scoring, and assessment in general, but I guess that's sort of the world we live in. But perhaps let's take a couple more comments from people with their hands up. Brian Jenner, we haven't heard from you yet, Brian.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, I run the European Speechwriter Network, and I'd very much like to concur with Susie about language learning. And recently I've been researching the history, and basically education started off by teaching people rhetoric. You know, you only learnt when you went to school in the Renaissance Latin and how to speak well, and they both enriched each other. And it's very interesting reading Quentin Skinner about how this caused trouble in the Civil War, which is a bit like the Brexit debate, that all these school kids could make rousing speeches, and it was social, you know, and they learned about the Republicans in Rome. And this was a problem because you're not supposed to be a citizen, as Stephen pointed out. You're supposed to be a subject to the monarch. And it is a great way of building social mobility, teaching public speaking skills. I got Elizabeth Truss to go to Toastmasters, which is a place where you learn to speak in public. And look where she is now. So,
yeah,
and also the other thing is that Michael Gove, 30 years ago, I was in the Oxford Union, and I could tell that in 30 years' time he would be in the cabinet. So the school system, if it wants to truly have social mobility, and there's a question about whether we really do want social mobility, is that these skills are absolutely paramount, and modern languages is an important part, or Latin and Greek was how people did it, and it was, you know, people stare at it being an elitist education, but actually it gives you the tools to you know, argue and to present yourself in a persuasive and winning way.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back, if I can, to Emma, who sort of opened us up, and maybe we can round us out, to talk about the reopening of schools and kids getting back into the classroom. And obviously there's a high level of anxiety about the gap that has opened up, but also obviously anxiety in general about safety and stress and readjusting and everything. Do you have a sense that the language gap has widened as well in this period of lockdown? And do you have a sense that the ability, therefore, for kids who have fallen behind to catch up, because, you know, their well-being will be suffering too? And we've talked about speech and well-being all being, it's sort of it's like a double compounding factor, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's been really, really interesting conversations going on, and so many points made in the chat which I've been following along, which I completely agree with, that this has to be inclusive. I mean, and I do think when we start talking about social mobility, there's this notion, and we talk about social mobility, we don't also mention the fact that, well, in the system that we have, when there are fewer spaces at the top, for some to reach the top, others have to go down. And so I'd rather talk instead about social justice and, you know, all boats rise on a high tide. So that's the kind of way I'd like to sort of talk and approach that. On the issue of speaking and listening and the importance of well-being, I was in fact talking to Sheffield Hallam, who at university are doing this fantastic work in training up undergraduates to be tutors and support students when they return to education, which is something I've been promoting, this idea of education supporting education. But crucially, what they were saying at the very beginning is our children don't need tutors, they need mentors. They need people to help them get back into learning, people to help them get back into that process of, you're going to be going back to school, and what have you just dealt with in these past few months? And I think also this language talking about children who have fallen behind, I think we have to acknowledge the reasons why they've fallen behind is because there hasn't been the adequate support there back at home, and problems that should have been recognised immediately simply were dealt with too late, you know, laptops and connectivity being two. It's all very well talking about, the importance of teachers, producing these online interactive lessons to students at home. But that presumes, of course, that everybody has a laptop, everybody has connectivity, and everybody has a space in which to learn it, which is simply not the case. So what we've seen during this time is a disadvantage being exacerbated even more than it's ever been before. So I think we should be talking about right now, there should have been mentors in there supporting children. How do we go back to learning again? As I say, having been a teacher for 11 years, the first couple of weeks back after any break, especially a summer break, is going to be about reintegrating into school life and into the classroom. This is going to be much bigger than that. And I think the importance of saying, when I was teaching, and I used to say, well, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth because we should listen twice as much as we should talk, which I know sounds strange when I'm promoting Orosi, but we really need to be listening to each other and listening to the experience that young people have had. And I hope that the government take this on board, because everybody who's worked with children know children don't learn when they feel upset, frustrated, not listened to, angry. And you can see some of them when they walk into the room like tiny little balls of rage, and it's almost radiating off them. So the first thing you need to do is recreate that climate and that environment where they feel safe, where they feel listened to, where they feel respected. And that's why Oracy is so important. And that's why I'm so strongly against this idea of silent classrooms. Because for everybody to feel valued, comfortable and safe, that puts them in that mindset then of being able to learn and being able to develop, because you've got to get that feeling set right. So I've loved all the comments, especially the comments on the importance of the Berko report someone mentioned, which is crucially important that we sort of push that at every moment about having an integrated and inclusive. And this isn't, I'm should say pleased to say about creating thousands of Michael Goves to join the cabinet office. But this is about making sure that everyone gets that sense of who they are and is able to communicate that and develop into whoever they want to be.
Thank you so much. If you can bear it, I know we're 2 minutes over, but I'm just going to keep going just briefly. If you can all go to the bottom of your screen or the top if you're on a tablet and find your participants button. In it, you should be able to find a little raise hand button, because I want to ask 2 questions and we're going to do a brief poll. It's not scientific, but get ready with your blue hand. 2 questions, if I can, just quickly. Firstly, is the education system as it is today preparing young people to develop the verbal communication skills they need for the world of work? As it is today, is our education system preparing young people to develop the verbal communication skills they need for the world of work? Put your hand up if you think yes, it is. 3, 4. 3 to 4. I think we can confidently say that's a minority view that they think it is. Okay, hands down, this is good. And then the second one is, should Oracy be formally assessed in schools? Imagine we had a scenario where Oracy was a sort of core part of how schools approach the curriculum and the techniques and what have you. Should it be formally assessed in the way that you would assess, I don't know, reading, writing, maths, whatever? Okay, a few more hands. Hope my colleague Harika is doing the counting. 1, 2, 3. Oh, yes, a lot more. Would we say that's maybe not quite half? Okay, interesting. Thank you very much indeed. I have had an absolutely brilliant hour. Thank you very much to everybody who has contributed in the chat and on screen and listened along. Of course, to Emma and Peter and Stephen and Paul, I've taken a ton of notes, and it's been a brilliant time for us coming off the back of our Education Summit last week, because we're putting together our kind of reporting to-do list around education in the UK and how we kind of follow up on that journalistically. There's a sort of 2 or 3 things that will sort of ring in my ears as I walk away from the Thinkln today. Firstly, where we started at the beginning, this idea that right now, with the world as it is, with political, adversarial political dialogue as it is, with social media being as it is, the ability for us all to disagree nicely and well is a skill that we don't just need to be teaching in the classrooms, we need to be teaching it in the pubs and in the sports grounds and every flipping where, and the motorway service stations and anywhere where there is a human being, the ability to disagree nicely would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. The second thing that really stuck with me was when Stephen started his opening gambit was, it's not easy to be a citizen in the way that it might be easy to be a consumer. It might not be easy to be a good consumer, but to be a citizen is hard, and perhaps we don't think of that very much either as we sort of raise kids and teach them the skills that they have. And I think that's worth remembering and thinking about. And the third thing, actually, from Sam, midway through her teacher training, that maybe it's not as bad as we think. Maybe there's more going on in this space, and that the moves are there, and that the will is there. And I very much hope that the findings from the APPG and the work that we've done today and that everybody else is doing can sort of lean into something that might be the beginnings of some momentum that can make a change. So thank you very much to everybody for contributing today. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. And if you would like to become a member of Tortoise, I very much hope you will do. tortoisemedia.com, there's the plug. And all the very best. Thank you very much. Bye.